Holy God, we do pray for your Holy Spirit to work through me and work through us as we seek some message from you, some message that will inspire us and carry us forward through difficult times. We ask these things in your holy name. Amen. And speaking of gratitude, I want to go back to last Sunday. At the end of the service, I'm so grateful for Leah for choosing We Shall Not Be Moved as the final song, and for speaking about, where'd you go? There you are. And for speaking about the Supreme Court decisions that had happened the week and the weeks before that. They didn't get mentioned, those decisions, at all during that service until the very end when Leah named it. And, we had communion and Independence Day and all these things to think about, but it was an omission because I know for a lot of folks here in this congregation, those Supreme Court decisions had real world impacts on your lives. And for all of us who are standing with you, we were all carrying that heavy burden. And so I'm so grateful for Leah for lifting it up and for singing that song. And that song in particular, We Shall Not Be Moved. I love a good We Shall Overcome. I'll sing that anytime we're invited to sing it and hold hands and light the candles, sing We Shall Overcome. But there is a nuanced but important theological difference between we shall overcome and we shall not be moved. We shall overcome makes it sound like we are doing the overcoming. Like if we just put our minds to it as human beings, we're gonna fix this world that we live in, and we're gonna set everything right, and everything's gonna be just if we will overcome. We shall not be moved is just a nuanced reminder that we're just gonna stand firm. And at some point, God's gonna finish the work. At some point, God is going to step in and do what we could not do. And today, we're going to sing after the sermon another song that's in that very same vein, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Us Around. We're going to keep on, what is it? I know we got to get this right. Walking, talking, and marching toward freedom land. But we don't get there on our own. We do the walking, we do the talking, we do the marching, but eventually God is going to step in and get us to that final destination. And as we read this text today from Paul, and we're going to get to the text, I need to set the table before we get to the text. The temptation that Paul says we're faced with is to believe that justice is inevitable. The temptation we are faced with is to relax and to cease being vigilant in our advocacy for justice. The temptation that Paul says we're faced with is to forget that there will always be people in this world who are seeking to enrich themselves at the expense of others. There will always be powerful people in this world who are seeking to get more power, even if it means harming those with less power. The temptation is to believe that there is hope that we are going to fix this, that we will overcome, that we will arrive, and we don't have to rely on God to get us there. That reaching that goal ultimately does require, reaching the goal requires that divine intervention. I love the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and far be it for me to criticize anything that King said. But man, it sure feels sometimes like it's more like we are in this battle for bending the moral arc of the universe, and it keeps being bent away from justice and away from justice. And I think the biblical understanding is that we do that work to keep it somewhere in line, and eventually God comes in and turns it towards justice at the end. We think about the Magnificat. I mean, let's ground this, what I'm saying, in the teachings of Jesus here. Jesus, in his life, in his example, in his teachings, consistently called us to stand with the vulnerable. Consistently called us to stand with the marginalized. Whether he was working with lepers who were literally on the margins of society and going out there and pulling them into the center, or whether he was working with tax collectors who were in a different category but also pushed to the margins of society, bringing them in, whether he was eating with sinners. He was always doing the work and calling us to do the work to stand with the marginalized, that to be followers of Jesus, not just to claim we believe in Jesus, not just to get the doctrine right, but to be followers of his example and followers of his teaching, to be faithful to that teaching. We stand with the marginalized. We stand with the powerless. That's where we are called to be. Mary's Magnificat said that God's work is ultimately to, let me get this right, scatter the proud in the thoughts of their heart, tear down the mighty from their thrones, lift up the lowly, fill the hungry with good things, and send the rich away empty. That ultimately there is this great reversal coming. And until we get to that great reversal, we will not be moved. We will not let anybody turn us around, but we don't get there on our own. So, when we look at things like the Supreme Court decisions, or any law, or anything that the powerful do, I want to invite you to step away from conservative and liberal. I want to invite you to step away from right and wrong. As Christians, let's look at every decision that the powerful make in terms of its effect on the powerless, in terms of its effect on the marginalized. If we are always standing with those on the margins, how does it feel when the powerful make a certain decision? What is the perspective of the marginalized in every decision? And if we look at the decisions of the Supreme Court in this past session, they weren't all wrong, or no, that's not, I told you not to use that word. They were not all harming the marginalized. There were some decisions that protected the marginalized. So the decision about the Alabama gerrymandering case that disenfranchised Black voters. There are 1 in 4 voters in Alabama that are Black. And the legislature of Alabama drew the districts so that they were even more of a minority, so they were even more marginalized, so they were even more disenfranchised. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's going too far. They in that case, they did something that helped the disenfranchised. They also made a decision that gave greater religious accommodations to workers. And whenever we're looking at power dynamics, usually the workers have less power than the employer. And to allow people who are working, for whom their religion, their faith, is a critical part of their well-being, to honor and observe their religious holidays and to protect their job while they do that, that was a decision that protects the workers, that protects the marginalized. They did something to protect the marginalized. They made a decision that to support the Native American Child Welfare Act, which supports Native American children who need to be removed from their birth family or who need to be adopted, supports them and gives a preference for them to be adopted by other Native American families, preserving Native American culture, and reversing the practice of taking Native children out of Native families when they may not have even needed to be taken out and placing them with white families. And so in that situation, the Supreme Court, if anybody's of the marginalized in this world, the Native Americans have been pushed into the margins on reservations. Now, they also made a lot of decisions that harmed the marginalized. Speaking of the Native Americans, they said that the Navajo Nation and the treaties that our nation made with the Navajo Nation did not guarantee, as far as I can know, access to clean water on the reservation. And if anybody needs a decision that protects access to water, it's Native Americans who have been pushed onto reservations where there's not great access to water. And keep in mind, all of these decisions are interpretations of the law. And what we're called to do as Christians is advocate for merciful interpretations of the law. Are the powerful using their power? Maybe they're not going to fix everything, but are they at least going to give some minimal protection? Are they at least going to stop harming those who have less power? And in this case, the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to do that here. We're not going to protect the Native Americans' rights to water. The Supreme Court decided that the government didn't have the power to regulate water pollution. Who is affected by water pollution? Well, everybody, but some people can get out of the way. Some people can move from being downstream. People who have wealth and power can get out of the way, and people who aren't able to move are stuck with the pollution. So you can't regulate water pollution. They said that Biden's student loan forgiveness program was unconstitutional. Again, that's an interpretation, right? That's an interpretation that says we are not going to help the poor. You know, the rich aren't getting student loans. This was a decision that directly affected those who did not have the resources like they should have to make a good life, to not be burdened by these student loans. And that interpretation there was not a merciful one. It was like, we know people are hurting. We know that if we claim to be Christian, we come from a tradition of Jubilee, which is a forgiveness of loans. And we're not gonna do that here. We're not gonna make the merciful decision. The Supreme Court decided that LGBTQ discrimination was okay in the marketplace. And you know, people can be a little confused about this one because we want to protect religious freedom, right? But in the marketplace that's protected by and created by the government, we can't say that some groups are allowed to be discriminated against. Everybody must have equal access to the marketplace, and everybody in it. And you know, people talk about this being a slippery slope. I think it probably is. But what we can say in this moment is that LGBTQ people who are seeking equal access to the marketplace to care for themselves and their family now have a little bit less access to it. But the Supreme Court in this case did not protect the minorities, the marginalized of this country. And then finally, affirmative action. And we know in our world, they said that it has to be colorblind when it comes to college admissions. But we know that in our world, that means default is to favor white people. And we've learned in this congregation over the years that in this society, in this white supremacist society, Black people and people of color are systematically discriminated against at every single step in their life. From higher infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates at birth, to consistent discriminatory access to medical care throughout their lives, to the consistent discrimination in the education system, to consistent discrimination in housing, to employment, every step along the way. We live in a society that sees color. And in this case, where there was a law that said, we're gonna, on the ladder up to economic success, when Black people and people of color have the rungs separated farther than the white people, and they have to reach higher to get to that rung, and the white people are just like, and for one rung, we're gonna bring that rung down and make it a little more equitable, not equal to white people's access to higher education, a little more equal. Because Black people still, if you get into Yale, you're still a Black person in Yale, right? We're gonna bring that access, that admission down just a little bit. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't look at color there. When every other decision in this country is made on the basis of color, we're gonna say, oh, you have to be colorblind there, which is the default is, we're gonna give greater access to white people. So, now let's talk about the text. Paul is writing to the Thessalonians, and he's talking about how much he misses them and loves them, and he's worried about them. So he's going to send Timothy to help, to check on them and to encourage them. He says, we're going to send somebody to strengthen and encourage you for the sake of your faith, so that no one would be shaken by these persecutions. That's what he's worried about. He's worried about Christians being shaken by the persecutions of this world. Indeed, you yourselves know that this is what we are destined for. Think about that in the context of what I've said earlier. if we are consistently standing with the marginalized, if we are consistently standing as Christians with the disenfranchised, with those with less power, we are destined for persecution in this world. In a world where the powerful will consistently victimize the less powerful, if we choose sides to stand with the less powerful, we are going to consistently be persecuted. We are destined for persecution. Indeed, you yourselves know that this is what we are destined for. In fact, when we were with you, we told you beforehand that we were to suffer persecution. So it turned out, as you know, and for this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that somehow the tempter had tempted you and that our labor had been in vain. The temptation that Paul is worried about is that people will lose faith, and he equates that with thinking that we don't need to be persecuted. That as Christians, we are not needing to put ourselves with the marginalized, to believe that maybe we are going to reach this just world where everything is okay. And he's saying that's never going to happen. Don't lose faith. You will always experience persecutions if you choose to follow Jesus. And just note that you might think, well, persecutions, Pastor Tom, that's a little heavy. Is that really what's happening? But remember, first of all, that Paul isn't talking here about Roman persecution. In 50 AD, the Christians weren't even on the Roman radar. This isn't people being thrown to the lions. This isn't people being burned at the stake. This is probably the persecution by 1,000 cuts, the death by 1,000 cuts. This is the Jewish community, the leaders of the Jewish community, excommunicating the Christians who want to be Jewish and believe in Jesus, saying, you can't be part of our community anymore. And just that little separation causes the Christians to struggle in a world where you're living at the edge of existence anyway, where you don't have the social safety nets. And if you're kicked out of your religious community, you lose that social safety net. That's the kind of persecution that Paul is talking about here, just the little persecutions of everyday life. And that is what we are called to experience with those who are marginalized. Don't let the tempter tempt you. We're talking about the devil 2 Sundays in a row. So mark that on your Govan Sunday morning bingo card if you have it. Okay? But this is Paul's message. Faith means that we never stop standing with the vulnerable. Faith does not mean that we overcome, that we fix it. Faith means that we shall not be moved. Faith means that we always stand with those who are hurting. That's the side we choose. Faith is not about believing the right doctrine. Faith is about who we choose to stand with. Faith means that we ain't going to let nobody turn us around from marching and walking and talking toward freedom land. Don't let the tempter believe you that any court decision or any legislation means that the world is coming to an end. There is an end coming that we believe in, and it's a great reversal of all things that is provided ultimately by God. But we are, as Christians, we're like the ravens, right? And we are losing the whole game. But we keep playing and we keep fighting until the last second when God, in the form of Justin Tucker, kicks a 99-yard field goal. Okay, that's our work. That's our calling. And until then, we stand with the marginalized. We will not be moved. We will not let anybody turn us around. Amen.